I was watching one of the biggest YouTube channels in this space, and I was impressed by the content. It lasted, I think the video was 2 hours, but it was highly detailed, and it was largely based on this extremely confident statement by an apologist who was extremely angry about people talking about Dionysus. And I just started thinking that the idea that the Bible has to be inerrant is not only a modern concept, maybe 150 years old, but anyone reading the text closely without trying to force it into a box can see that there are blunders left and right. We're only going to look at three main ones. It'll take a few slides. On one of them, we have to look at what it says in Mark and then what it says in First Samuel, but I think you're going to find it interesting. Let me move this out of my way. Yeah, there you go, upper right. Genesis 3:15 through 17. As usual, I'm reading from the King James Version, which can be a challenge. And you definitely get Microsoft Word underlining words all the time, such as slayeth. But well, I don't know. I kind of like the way it sounds. And the Lord said unto him, Cain, therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain. Lest means so that not. In case you're, some people think it means unless. Lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. And what's wrong with that? This is only the third chapter. As far as the creation story is going, God created Adam. From Adam, he created Eve. And Adam didn't know his wife. And bore a son, Cain, and then again with Abel. Unfortunately, then Cain slays or kills his brother out of jealousy. I don't know why the Lord took favor on Abel's offering, but not from Cain. But if you read it as mythology, it doesn't have to make sense. If you think this is literally what happened, who witnessed it? And also, we've only seen Adam, Eve, and their two sons. So then Cain kills Abel, and then this is what happens. Why do we need a mark on Cain? Who are these other people who may accidentally take vengeance and somehow receive sevenfold the punishment? How could you multiply Cain's punishment 7 times or 3 times? I don't know. And then what is this land of Nod? And where did this wife come from? And Cain knew his wife. I remember back in high school, I was probably 15, and I had attended church with my grandparents and great grandparents, and it had a distinctly Southern and evangelical flair. So, as embarrassing as it is, when I saw both Jimmy Swaggart and Jerry Falwell preaching, it sounded similar to what I was used to, except that, Jimmy was really good on the piano, like his cousin Jerry Lee Lewis. But I remember Falwell saying, people often ask, how could Cain have found a wife? It's very simple. I'll tell you right now. Adam and Eve had other children. He just had this smug smile. And I just, oh, that's interesting. At 15, wasn't being a critical thinker. It's like, how would you know that? Where did you find that in the text? And why is that comforting to you? That's called incest. Although, if you've seen one or two of our others, whenever it's Lot and the daughters, it's likely you're going to see some incest. But they both got Lot drunk on successive nights and lay with him and did conceive of their father. But I don't see how you can say that Adam and Eve had other kids. It doesn't say that in the text, and it's pretty gross if that's the case. Anyway, it's a creation myth. Other channels have taken deep dives into the fact that Chapter 1 and chapter 2 aren't just at odds, they're two different creation myths. That's beyond my background. I just like to focus on text, a bachelor's degree in English lit slash rhetoric, master's degree in English slash creative writing. I think the best way to look at the Bible is just to look at for internal consistency among the text. All right. So that's Genesis, obviously the first book of what? Of an anthology known as the Bible. That's what the Bible is. Each book was a separate book. At some time, church leaders decided to start putting them together. But a lot of people think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all were one bound book or something. No, they've changed. All right, so when were the four Gospels in the Bible written? The first one was Mark at the earliest. I think the agreement would be 70 AD, which would be about 40 years after the crucifixion. Mark is a much more lean gospel, and Jesus is more enigmatic, and the disciples never seem to get what's going on. It's a lot more about mystery. If you've ever seen or heard of Bart Ehrman, when he was a graduate student at Princeton, this is the verse that got under his skin back when he was still a fundamentalist evangelical. And he wrote a complicated paper explaining why this was not a mistake. And then his professor, Bruce Metzger, I think he wrote rather than said, maybe Mark just made a mistake. And that changed the way he looked at the Bible. It didn't make him deconstruct right away, but he's like, oh, wow. My mentor is saying maybe Mark made a mistake. So not all believers stick to the idea that everything in here actually happened. There can be no mistakes. Mark chapter 2, that's early on, 23 through 28. This isn't that easy to read either. All right. And it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said unto him, behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, have ye never read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the shewbread, which is not lawful to eat but for the priests, and gave also to them which were with him. And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Okay, so Jesus obviously knows the scripture. In one of the Gospels, he's astounding people in the synagogue by his knowledge. What does the Old Testament verse or passage that he's referring to say? Oh, wow. No wonder people don't read the Bible all that often. Look at that. That's just verses 1 through 6. 1 Samuel chapter 21. Again, these are not names with which I'm familiar. Then came David to Nob, it's the town, to Ahimelech, the priest. What? Don't you remember when David came in when Abiathar was the high priest? First Samuel says it was Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, why art thou alone, and no man with thee? And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, the king hath commanded me of business, and hath said unto me, let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. Now therefore, what is under thine hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread. 5 loaves, where do we hear that? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present. And the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days. Sorry, since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy. Ew. And the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the shew bread, that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. Okay, so the Bible is inerrant, and obviously Jesus is God incarnate. So you have we can either pretend that Abiathar and Ahimelech are the same thing, maybe, or we can make one of the two obvious conclusions. Mark got it wrong, like Bruce Metzger said to Bart Ehrman. Maybe Mark just made a mistake, or Jesus got it wrong, which is kind of interesting. It's Mark. Jesus is much more earthy. Maybe he's saying, yeah, he did pretty good for an illiterate. Whoa, that's blasphemy. It's not blasphemy to say that Jesus was illiterate. He was a person on earth living in an area where only the extremely or the affluent and the elite families could often afford a tutor. So the writers of the Gospels, that's who they were. And that's why they wrote in Greek, and they were not from this part of the world. And, they took stories, both oral and maybe some written down, but either Jesus made a mistake or Mark did. I think it qualifies as a Bible blunder. Well, the historical Jesus is often argued by apologists, and historically, he had 12 disciples. I don't know how often they're called disciples. They're often just called the 12. And I also wonder, what's the difference between a disciple and an apostle? Those terms seem to be used loosely. Are these the disciples, and then anybody after that is an apostle? Yeah, but they still have Peter and Paul. I don't. All right. There are four gospels. The first three, Mark, Matthew, Luke, are synoptic in Greek. I believe that means seen together. So we shouldn't need to add John. Obviously, these three purported eyewitnesses, according to some apologists, would have these names exactly right. And it starts out looking pretty good, right through what? Bartholomew. That must be Bart Ehrman's name. Simon Peter, Andrew, James. In Mark, he calls James and John the sons of Zebedee. And then the other two, I think they say James and John. Philip, Bartholomew. What's kind of interesting, though, is how many of those people have any personality? Simon Peter is a main character. I think James and John may ask him if they get to sit on the right and left hand of him in heaven. I couldn't tell you who Philip or Bartholomew are. And then Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus. Why does only one of them say son of Alphaeus? Why does only one of them have somebody named Thaddeus? Only one of them has Lebbaeus, and only one has a Simon called Zelotes. Simon the Canaanite, Simon. So they have two Simons, all right? I mean, each one has Simon Peter, and then a Simon the Canaanite, or just Simon. Who's Judas, the brother of James? James who? You have James and John? Okay, so maybe yeah, that implies Luke is not calling James and John the sons of Zebedee. Otherwise, it would have been Judas, the brother of James and John, probably. Judas Iscariot, Matthew just calls him Judas, and then Judas Iscariot would probably cut some slack there. But when the case for Christ tries to point out that in court, if the witness testimony is too similar, it's rehearsed. Yet in court, if they were trying to convict someone, the prosecution, and they were using witnesses to name 12 accomplices, these witnesses would probably be excused or just torn apart on cross-examination by the defense. Basic fact. We could also look at the time of day, how the crucifixion went down, why it went down. The problem is making a bold statement first and then trying to fit the Gospels into your decision that they have to agree on all main points. The reality is they were written separately. Matthew and Luke both seem to use Mark and also another source. John seems to know about these, but they're not trying to tell the same story. Why would they? If Matthew thought Mark was a complete gospel, why would he write his? You can see why. He wants to tie things back to the Old Testament. He wants to give a lineage. He wants a birth narrative, and you end up with a different character. Luke has a completely different birth narrative, but Mark doesn't bother with a birth narrative. Each gospel was intended to just stand alone. And if you can't get the basic facts of the crucifixion, how the birth narrative went down and when, where everybody went, and then you can't even get the list of the 12, right? Anyway, inerrancy, no. It makes a lot of work for apologists to go around in their mocking, sneering tones at how crazy people are and how easily they could just, oh, well, this obviously means that. And if you read in Maimonides or if you read in Flavius Josephus, they just start filling the room with hot air. If you look at it honestly and say, well, let's see, is the Bible inerrant? Well, we can't get the names of the 12 the same among three reported eyewitnesses. And yet again, Jesus is arguing with the religious authorities, but apparently when he read First Samuel, he thought it was Abiathar, and First Samuel says it's Ahimelech. So, which book of the Bible is wrong? Was Jesus wrong? It's an inconsistency. It doesn't have to be a shattering of faith. That's only if you start out saying the Bible is inerrant, and I will do everything I can to defend that. Yeah, you could also just read the text. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.